Is everyone hearing me okay? I'm having some feedback. Okay. I'm really excited for the panel that we have today. Today we're going to be talking about ending harmful subsidies, which I'm sure for everyone in this room, or most of the people in this room, we at least know that SDG 14 Target 6 is ending harmful fishery subsidies by the end of 2020. I'm sure you all are also making that frightful realization that we are almost at the end of 2020 already. I'm a little bit glad to be done with the year, but also scared about all the end of the year things we have to wrap up now. But in doing so, one of the last things that we want all of our young ocean leaders to get engaged on is this issue and how young people can get involved and pressure their leaders and their countries to support the World Trade Organization negotiations in ending these harmful subsidies and to stop funding overfishing. So without any further ado, Brandon will start a brief introductory video from Sir David Attenborough, who I don't think does not need introduction.
Thank you, Ron, and thank you all again for coming today. It's really a blessing to be able to convene like this from all over the world, as you see, and to be spending this time very intentionally discussing ways in which we can come together to support a really important campaign that is affecting the livelihoods of millions of people all over the world. So we will begin, as Ron mentioned, with a video keynote that was pre-recorded by Sir David Attenborough on behalf of the World Economic Forum, and we were given permission to screen this for you all today. And I think it provides a wonderful background on this issue. And who doesn't love to start a Zoom webinar by listening to Sir David Attenborough? I mean, he's the biggest thing since sliced bread. I think he's more famous than Justin Bieber at this point, and I'm really happy about that personally. So without further ado, let's share this video and learn a bit more about this issue from David Attenborough himself.
Imagine a healthy ocean, abundance and vitality restored. And not just any ocean. Your ocean. Every corner of every ocean around the world, vibrant, abundant, and productive. Healthy seabeds. Fish stocks recovered. Monitored wisely. Fished sustainably. And feeding many more people than they do now. The good news is that it is possible. But we are standing in our own way. We are paying huge sums of money, public money, to keep damaging and destructive fishing activities afloat. Government subsidies are keeping fishing boats fishing, even when there are too few fish left for fishing to be profitable. These subsidies create tensions between competing fishermen and nations. And they also fund the ongoing destruction of the natural world on which we all depend. But all is not lost. We can turn this around right now. Your governments have been tasked with negotiating new global rules on fisheries subsidies by the end of this year to set us all on a more sustainable course. The World Trade Organization has previously negotiated global rules for government subsidies to industry and farming. Now it's time to put an end to subsidies that harm our oceans too. Around the globe, small-scale projects are already paving a way forward, showing how investment in local coastal communities can lead to remarkable recoveries under the waves. A global deal to end harmful fishery subsidies is the next vital step in the restoration of our oceans to their former abundance and diversity. Reaching the right deal might not be easy, but a sustainable future for the oceans and ourselves is within reach. We must seize this opportunity and act now to ensure a healthier future for each and every one of us forever.
Bravo. So I hope that provided a bit of a backdrop for our conversation today. And just to remind all of us really why we are here and what Sustainable Ocean Alliance is all about. We exist really to serve our global community. Many of you are here today. Many of you have attended incredible global events pre-pandemic, and hopefully will attend more post-pandemic. But we exist at SOA to provide mentorship, project funding, event scholarships, and learning opportunities, such as these webinars, which we call Ocean Learning Labs, for our young leaders and for people worldwide, so we can raise our awareness about critical ocean issues, such as fishing subsidies, deep sea mining, or plastic pollution, and learn the tools and ways of being from both an inner holistic lens, but also from an external facing sense for how we can really affect change in the world. So today we are going to hone in on a very important topic, and I'm going to hand the virtual microphone back to my colleague Ron Tardif to introduce our panelists and get going in our discussion today. Thank you all for coming. Ron?
Thanks, Brandon, for that introduction and setting the stage and why SOA and Pew are together hosting this panel today. So today we have 4 panelists joining us. We have Dr. Rashid Simaila, who's from the University of British Columbia. He's someone who's, every time he publishes a paper and an article, it's definitely one of the top of my list to read that week. So I hope that many of you know, working in fisheries, are aware of his name and his work. We also have Andres Cisneros Montemayor, who is joining us also from University of British Columbia. We have Michelle Kuruc, who's joining us from the World Wildlife Fund. And we have Rana Gilbert, who's joining us here on behalf of Pew Charitable Trusts. I will not take up any more time, but I will tell them, the panelists, that they're going to introduce themselves, talk a bit more about their work. And they're all going to be asking the question, answering the question, why should young people care about ending harmful fishery subsidies? So I don't know if we've set an order, but I think Dr. Simaila is to begin.
So thank you very much for organizing this, for all the work you do in terms of reaching young people, reaching the future, essentially. And I get always excited when I get the chance to interact with young people, because really, if we're going to make the world a better place, to make it a livable planet, then we have to engage our young people. The future is theirs. I mean, we're part of it, but really they are the big picture. So I'm really happy to do this. Another thing that makes me happy is when Ron, when you said that Attenborough is more popular or more famous than Justin, I was really happy. It's good to see somebody trying to protect our environment, which is the place everything starts. Being popular than somebody who makes us happy with music. That is important, but I don't think as important as sustaining life on the planet, which is what Attenborough's life has been. So that is great. In terms of what I do, I actually, these days, I call myself as an interdisciplinary oceans and fisheries economist. And all that I try to do, me and my team and colleagues all over the world, is how do we use economics together with other disciplines to help us sustain our oceans so that it can also sustain us, you know. I like to say that from the ocean and the environment, good things come to people, and to the environment, all the bad things we generate, pollution and plastic and all, go back to the ocean. And we need to do this sensibly in order that this can continue to happen to help us continue life here. So that's me and what I do. And in terms of your question, I think the youth is central to the effort to remove subsidies for many reasons. Number one, the subsidies are really large. We estimate about $35 billion that our government passed on to the fishing sector for all sorts of reasons. But a big chunk of this, 22 billion, which is a huge chunk of the 35, actually goes to undermine the oceans. It leads to overfishing. We are talking about fuel subsidies. That's the big one among the 13 different types of subsidies we look at. That goes to the sector, and you just see it. If fuel is a big part of the cost of fishing, if you reduce that through subsidies, it just makes people fish more than they would without the subsidies, and that is where the overfishing comes in. And another thing that's important for youth all over the world, but especially in developing countries and countries in Africa, is that when your government spend $1 to overfish, that is the same dollar that is now going to build hospitals or to put infrastructure to improve the lives of people. And this kills me. Coming from West Africa, this is distant. When I go to the corner, I say, come on, is this what you want to do, Fisheries Minister? To use the scarce resources to undermine the resources coastal people depend on, or to improve the system? So it's very important for all of us, but especially for the youth. And why is this? It undermines the ecosystem, biodiversity, which is important in itself, but that also means that there will be less food for us to eat. In fact, one of our colleagues has predicted that if we continue overfishing the way we are doing, in not too distant future, we may end up with only jellyfish to eat. Just think about that. I mean, so the current generation, we swallow up all the tuna, the cod, the salmon, and leave jellyfish for our future generation. Crazy to even think about. So there is a lot here for you to be worried about. It's your future jobs, it's your food, it's biodiversity for the future that is being threatened by all the dollars we throw at the fishing sector, which goes to kill the resources. So I'll stop here for my colleagues to chip in. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simaila. Next, Andres.
Sure. So maybe the question was, why should young people care about, ending harmful fishing subsidies? And I think, in a nutshell, these are our oceans, right? These are going to be our oceans. And the reason the harmful fishery subsidies operate under the assumption that the oceans are inexhaustible. And that's something that 50 or 100 years, it's always been wrong, but 50 or 100 years ago, they may or may not have been totally sure about that. Now we're 100% sure that they're not, in fact, inexhaustible. And so I think now that, young people are coming in to their own and into governments and into industry too, right? A lot of young people fish as well. It's time to really break with that paradigm. And I think, to give you an anecdote from my perspective, I'm from a small fishing town in Mexico, Guaymas. And the reason I am in this field, I'm also an ocean economist, is because as a young kid, my parents are biologists. And as a young kid, I would go out to measure fish and all this stuff. And then they tell me about sustainability. And this is the reason we're measuring this stuff, so we can get maximum sustainable yield, right? And even from back then, I wonder, well, wait a minute. If we're able to get all these benefits from the oceans, why is everyone so poor in my community where I live, right? Like, why is it such a poor town if we're getting all this fish from the ocean? And that's always sort of been my driving passion, is to do something about that. And so I think now with a lot of young people in the world today, I think I still count myself as young. I'm pretty sure I'm like still in that bracket where I can do that. And I think it's, 20, 30 years after, that little kid wondering why everyone was so poor, I go back to my hometown, not right now because of the pandemic, unfortunately, but everything's pretty much the same. Nothing has really changed, and now, with the benefit of that hindsight and all the different research that I've been lucky enough to do, in my career so far, you realize that part of the reason for that is the policies that we've been trying to do for the last 50 years are just flat out wrong. And harmful subsidies are a good example of that, right? So anyone who's from a tropical country on the call, and I saw it's so cool that everyone is here from like all over the world, are probably familiar with like shrimp fisheries, right? Especially if you're from Latin America like me. And you've heard about all the bycatch that shrimp has, shrimp trawls, and how destructive it can be for ecosystems. And I recently was asked to do sort of an updated study on this, specifically related to harmful fisheries subsidies. And we found, again, right, shrimp fishing in Latin America, it supports a lot of jobs. It still supports a lot of income from people, almost 200 million a year. And, this includes like El Salvador, Nicaragua, Guatemala, a lot of these communities, there's not a lot of alternative options, right? So these are important fisheries. And yet, 80% of everything that's caught in these shrimp trawls is not shrimp, right? It's bycatch. It's little fish that would have been caught by artisanal communities, right? And all of that is just thrown overboard, right? What a waste. And when you look at it in terms of subsidies, these are some of the fisheries that get a lot of subsidies in a lot of our countries in Latin America, right? And it's the same all over the world. If you look at Rashid's papers, I look at this from a global level, it's kind of the same story, right? And so what I was really struck by in doing this stuff, really pouring through all the statistics and even the national legislation are two things. One is not one of the countries actually has a plan to see what the subsidies are doing to the fishery. Can you imagine that? This is public money, right? This is our money, like tax money. And so here you have this fishery that is known to be really destructive, right? That is known to be effective artisanal fishing communities that we're giving money to, and we don't even know what the money's doing, right? There's no plan in place. That was one thing. The second thing that I was really struck by was actually how amazing all of these policies are on paper, right? You go to any of the countries all over Latin America, which is where I'm looking specifically, but I'll bet you if you go and look in Africa or Southeast Asia or anywhere, you'd find similar stuff, right? If you look at it on paper, all these countries have exactly the types of regulations you would hope to have, right? So limits on effort and on catch and minimum sizes, and you have to have turtle excluder devices, and you have to, combat illegal fishing, everything you would hope for, right? And yet, in one national document after another, the main challenge they identified to actually implementing all this stuff was we don't have enough money. And so again, here you have all this money that's being given with no oversight to fisheries that we know are harmful and using subsidies that we know are harmful. And we don't have money to do the stuff that we know is right. And that's actually already in our laws, right? And so I think as a young person, that really rankles me. And it's like, no, it's time to stop this, right? And so any excuses that we might have in the past are in the past. At this point, we have more than enough information to know what we need to do going forward. And frankly, I think in a newer generation, we are much more committed to actually putting this into action.
Thanks.
Sorry, Ron. Yeah.
Yeah, just thank you so much. It was a really apt example. And I think really important to illustrate that just by putting something on paper does not mean that that is having an impact in the real environment. And I think a lot of our young ocean leaders who are, on the ground in those environments will have seen similar things. So now I'll go to Michelle. It's your turn.
Thank you. Hi, young ocean leaders. It's really great to be here with you today. First, just a brief word of introduction. As you know, my name is Michelle Kurick. I'm the Vice President for Ocean Policy at the World Wildlife Fund in the United States. Unlike your other panelists, I'm a lawyer by training. So I deal in the world of policy and words and all of these things that we're talking about, as well as diplomacy. I have spent some time at the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. I worked there for about 7 years. So I've seen a lot of the types of negotiations that are occurring at the World Trade Organization up close and personal. Anyway, well, harmful fishing subsidies are driving 3 big problems in our oceans today. First, as you already heard, overcapacity. Too many boats chasing too few fish. There are over 3 million fishing vessels active in our oceans. Subsidies help put more boats on the water, help others expand their ability to catch more fish, and keep many more boats there than otherwise would be, propping up their ability to make money when they otherwise should stop fishing. Second, subsidies also fuel overfishing, and more than 80% of the world's fish stocks are overfished or at capacity. And finally, subsidies also support illegal fishing, which have an estimated value of over 36 billion US dollars per year. That's right. Some illegal operators receive subsidies, and as you heard, this is public money, your money, which pays them while they commit violations against an exhaustible public resource. And in some countries, even after they're convicted of violations, the subsidies do not stop. They are not disqualified from getting more money. And I hope if you're not outraged by all the rest of this, that you're outraged by that, and you absolutely should be. You've already heard that a huge amount of money is funneled into harmful subsidies every year. I think the figure that Dr. Simaila quoted was about 22 billion US dollars. And the activities that these subsidies enable, they hurt our oceans and the people who depend on them for their livelihoods, food security, and community stability. You've heard this from the other speakers. This is not a question. The harmful subsidies undermine attempts at responsible fisheries management. And you can see from the 3 categories of activities that I just described, none of those could be called desirable, responsible fish management outcomes, none of them. Among other things, they compromise the ability to get accurate data collection, which is clearly a foundation that's needed for all good fisheries management. And the funds could be so much better spent if they were channeled into improving that same fisheries management. You heard about the trade-offs. You've heard the other speakers give good examples of those. Dollars that go into subsidies aren't doing other things that society needs. And if they were redirected even into the fisheries space, into better fisheries management, they could be more helpful to the small-scale fishers, who Andreas described so well. You know, they're often considered to be the main beneficiaries of these subsidies. But that's a real question as to whether they really are getting any kind of benefit from these monies. And I think that the research has also shown that, in fact, they're a relatively small proportion of the actual recipients of the money. It's usually the large-scale fishers that are actually the beneficiaries of this money. And we can't expect, you know, the communities, these disempowered sort of communities in the least developed countries that already are struggling with the COVID crisis, to be stewards of our ocean resources unless they're supported and empowered. They need technical assistance and capacity building. You know, we're talking about these subsidies as international policy work. And you've heard a few other stories. I'm going to tell you one too. Policy work is kind of funny business. Lots of young people, probably many in this audience today, feel that in the early stages of their professional lives or as they go through their education, they would love to work on policy. A lot of people say that. And I think they realize how important it is to design policy well and how much of an impact it can have. And that's certainly all true. And I don't think many government officials intentionally set out to make bad policy. But here's the reality of policy. Very little of it is data-driven, pure policy. It gets bastardized by political interests, short-term concerns, competing priorities, special interests, incomplete formulation and gaps, weak implementation, inadequate funds, inadequate capacity, inadequate technical know-how regarding implementation, corruption, lack of understanding, lack of courage, and the need for compromise. We're reaching a critical time in these negotiations. The pressure needs to stay on for a high ambition outcome. And thank you for your support. Please keep it up. Make your voice heard. Influence those who will make these decisions. Let them know you care how they are dealing with your future. Stop funding overfishing. I know there's going to be a link in the chat to the toolkit that can help you do this. Together, we can all do this. Thank you.
Yeah, I agree. That was really rousing. Thank you so much, Michelle, for that introduction and those really important and salient comments. And I think you will find that a lot of people in our audience are interested in the policy world, and I hope that they take your comments to heart. And last but certainly not least is Rana Gilbert, who has been one of the co-organizers of this panel today, and who will give us some great context on where we are in these last days of the negotiations.
Well, yes, thank you, Ron and Brandon, for having us. Like Ron said, I'm Rana Gilbert with the Pew Charitable Trust, and we've been supporting the negotiations for the past 2 years. And just, on the opening question of why you all should care, especially as young people, about this fishery subsidies negotiation process, because they jeopardize the future of our ocean, like our speakers have said. But, with these negotiations in particular, the international community has long recognized the need to discipline these subsidies. And in 2001, nearly 20 years ago, the WTO first agreed to clarify and improve these rules. And today, there's also a mandate from the UN Sustainable Development Goal 14.6, as we know, which countries have agreed to. So, the progress is being made. Just last week, the chair of the negotiations released his updated consolidated text, which takes elements from members' proposals and puts them all into one document so that members can negotiate on the basis of one text. And that is progress that we haven't seen in nearly a decade in these negotiations. And so the chair has been vocal in recognizing the importance of reaching this agreement and of reaching the mandates. And as he says, as he jokes, the negotiations will be old enough to drink in many countries already, having started in the year 2001, as I said. So, as young people, we are inheriting a planet that's facing increasing environmental challenges and threats, overfishing being one of the main ones. And the good news is with the Fisheries Subsidies Agreement is that we can help fish stocks rebound. A bioeconomic model that was developed by the University of California, Santa Barbara, which I will get into more detail later, reveals for us that if the WTO members were to completely remove harmful subsidies, fish biomass could actually rebound by 12.5% in just 30 years. And so by removing that excess capacity, you actually help the fish populations to recover and to rebound to their former state. So there's no single collective act that governments can take to solve such a pressing environmental threat. Unlike this subsidies agreement, this agreement does present that opportunity. So as young people, we should be holding our governments accountable to what they've already agreed to, not only with the WTO mandates, but the UN Sustainable Development Goal mandates. And we should be pressuring our leaders to make this agreement happen, and we should be raising our voices and to finally encourage governments this year to end harmful fishery subsidies and to stop funding overfishing.
Thank you, Reyna. We just had one comment, and I just want to address that one now. So I'm posting in the chat the Subsidy Explorer, which has actually been developed by, I think, everyone here, especially the fisheries group at UBC. So check that out, and that might answer your question about subsidies. And so now we're moving into the question and answer, moderated question and answer part of the panel. I encourage you to still keep writing in Q&As. And maybe to the panelists, if while another panelist is speaking, you want to browse the Q&A and see if you can give an answer. That way we have less at the end. That would be great. So my first question is for Dr. Simaila. We know that overfishing is a leading driver of the depletion of fish populations, as we've heard. But how can we say that subsidies play a part? Andre said that we don't know how to evaluate them. So how have we evaluated them? How do we know that they're playing their part? And are they necessary? So why are we still doing them if they're not? You're on mute.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And this mute thing, it always beats me. So if I was a programmer, I would just create an app to get it going precisely when somebody is expected to talk back. Okay. Now to your question, very good question. I'll approach that. I'll just give you two examples, one from academic work and one from evidence on the ground. In the first place, we did a paper, and this was a long time ago, 2010, we published a paper where we looked at bottom trawlers operating in deep and the high seas, how they are doing economically. And this is what we found. We found that if you look at the profitability of those vessels, without subsidies, they make on average about 10% profit on their gross revenues, their landed value. Now, then we calculated the subsidies they get as a group, and that was 25%. So just do the simple arithmetic. They get 25% of their gross revenues from your taxes, and they make only 10%. If you take out those 25% subsidies, that tells you a bulk of those vessels will stop fishing because they won't be able to make it. So that's one clear evidence from research. The second one is, I think last year we published a paper looking at boats operating in the high seas. For those who don't know, the high seas is areas of the ocean that is beyond 200 nautical miles from the coast of any coastal country, because that is far away, and the world has agreed anything within 200 miles is your waters, but over that is the high seas. We look at that, working together with a number of groups in California and the US and Asia and around the world. What we found is that if you take out subsidies and you also adjust the slave level kind of income, wages these boats pay to people, they are almost working under slavery conditions. We call them modern slaves. If you take those two out, 54% of the fishing grounds in the high seas will not be profitable. And that is, so they become protected areas automatically just by taking away the subsidies. So 2 academic papers. Now, if you remember, a few years ago, fuel prices were going up and up, and there was lots of demonstration around the world because fishing companies couldn't fish. It was just too expensive. In Europe, they were asking for more subsidies so they can go further and deeper, right? That's an example on the ground. And in Malaysia, there was a demonstration, and the government quickly advanced subsidies, and they went sailing. They would tie their boats, right? They got more subsidies and they go. So this is real. Subsidies really, if you take them, that will cut down overfishing. Are they needed? You know, in all our, we talk about good subsidies and bad subsidies, you know, beneficial subsidies and harmful subsidies. The harmful subsidies, I don't see why we do it. We can take away this $22 billion, not away from the community, keep them in the community, but let them work for nature and people rather than undermine nature and people. So some subsidies are needed, and definitely many other subsidies are not. So that is that. I'll come back to talk about gender implications and youth implications later if I get the chance. Stop here for my colleagues.
Okay, thank you very much for that clear answer. Did any of the other panelists want to jump in? Okay, so this one is for Andres. We've heard from Dr. Simaila that certain subsidies are harmful, and why maybe some could be useful, but most are not. So perhaps you could dig more into that. If subsidies can be helpful or beneficial, how can countries shift to providing more of these types of subsidies, and especially to support those artisanal and small scale fishers sectors that you mentioned in your opening remarks?
For sure. Yeah. Thanks, Ron. So I think the first thing that governments need to do is prohibit those harmful subsidies, right? And this is what we're talking about now. Like, this is what the agreement is for. And the reason why is because, like I said before, there's no actual arguments for continuing to use them except for either inertia or power dynamics where people are capturing them, or as Rashid said, these really perverse feedback loops where you like overfish or catching less and say, well, now I'm not making ends meet, so I need more subsidy. So you overfish more, and so on, right? And so we need to break that by prohibiting those harmful subsidies. And so once you do that, that actually kind of allows us to think carefully about how we can support the communities. And the very first thing that people need to do at every level is listen to the communities. Like, I can't tell you how many times I've been in communities, not just in Latin America, other places in the world, and you know, you're chatting about subsidies, usually not like in a formal setting. This is more like a beers after work chat kind of thing. And people will say, you know what, we don't need these fuel subsidies or these boats. What we really need is X, you know, and that can be, oh, we would really love to have a health clinic in our community so I don't have to drive all the way to the capital, or a school here so the kids can actually go to school and not have to drop out after a while because it's too hard to get them to where the school actually is, you know, or connectivity, where a lot of these places don't have any internet or anything. So they're not even sure if the prices they're getting from the buyers that are coming in are fair or not, right? Someone say, oh, you know what, I heard from someone that they're actually getting so much more than they're telling us, right? And so all these different things are things that can be supported by governments, but they're not harmful. right? And so there are all these other options that we have, and we can learn from past examples of places where we have done reforms, right? So we've done reviews all over the world of looking at what happens when you actually switch away from harmful subsidies, right? And what things are useful and what things aren't useful. And what you find is that there's some really clear instances where if you actually focus on making sure the supports go to the people that need them in the community, surprise, that tends to be really much more helpful, right? And so unfortunately, it doesn't take, and I love Michelle's comment about policy versus politics. It doesn't take much to realize why those things aren't happening. The reason they aren't happening is because someone is benefiting from the current subsidy programs, right? And so again, that's why I think if you start right at the beginning, prohibit those harmful subsidies, that just allows us to really change that narrative of reform from something that's harming communities which I think you mentioned, Ron. So it's often thought as like, oh, why don't you want to help communities? That's not it at all. We want to help communities, but this is not being helpful, right? And so we need to change that around, and that's, I think, the way we go forward.
Yeah, Andres. I think I just posted in the chat that this is something that has come up across several panels that I've been moderating. Most recently, there's another one on fisheries for our SOA demo day. And before that, it was plastics. And before that, it was on, I think it was community action. And all of those, one of the overarching themes that we came to was this listening to the community. So I'm glad to hear you say exactly that. This next question is for Michelle. So you've mentioned that you have experience working with the FAO on fisheries monitoring and enforcement technologies. How do regulations like subsidies agreements help combat harmful activities like IUU globally? And does this draft text serve as a solid basis, or does it leave room for circumvention, working around? How solid is it?
Yeah, thanks a lot for that question. I know we haven't really talked much yet about mechanics or process, and yet, this is the heart of diplomacy. I mean, this is how the countries of the world come together, as imperfect a process as it is. This is what we've got. And so I thought I would maybe say two things in favor of the process, maybe not the exact text, but the process itself. And first, when you think about it, okay, so the World Trade Organization has, if my numbers are right, about almost 160 member countries. So if you were going to have each country on their own try to go off and create national law that dealt with harmful subsidies, number one, you can, thank you, 164. Okay, number's not quite right. But anyway, you get the idea. A lot. There's a lot. And everybody has their own perspective, their own localized experience that influences how they think about these issues. So if you are going to have all 164 WTO members go off and try to create national law around this topic, you would have, number one, even though this has taken 20 years, you probably would not be in this place with all 164 countries, even after 20 years, if everybody was going off and doing it on their own. That's just the nature of sort of the large, conflagration of different ideas and different motivators that are pushing and pulling in individual national systems. So here in this process, you have everybody seeing and hopefully agreeing to the same terms. That's a huge advantage. Everybody's starting basically in the same place after having heard all the arguments, getting a chance to sort of make their own points, and having, trying to get support or having their positions picked apart by others. So that's one. The second thing is really the timing issue. And yeah, I know diplomacy is like watching the grass grow. It's the slowest thing you can imagine. It's crazy slow, but it's what we've got. And yes, we could try to blow up the process, and maybe one day you all will do that. But this is what we've got now. And grass grow indeed. I heard somebody say that once to me, and after sort of watching it up close and personal for so many years, I'm like, that's a great comparison, it's just like you hardly notice it. Something's going on there, but it's so slow. And that is very much what diplomacy is like. So you have this timing issue where everyone, all the different countries that have been participating in these negotiations, and hopefully, by the end of December, we will reach a successful outcome. They will all then be at the same place. And that's, even though it might seem small, when you think about the proliferation of different schemes, different timings, different understandings that would result without an international agreement. And there are many issues in fisheries that are taking that tact right now. And you can see how complicated it becomes very, very quickly. Everybody's got their own ideas. They've got their own priorities. Yes, they say they want to cooperate. They say they want to do, have exchanges and have sort of alignment internationally. That is very hard to do. It's easy to say, but it's very hard to get there. And I just, for 1 second, wanted to address some of the comments in the chat about data and monitoring under this agreement, because I think those are really important points, because we really, in spite of the really great work that has been done by a number of our panelists in terms of trying to research this, it is not always crystal clear exactly how much everybody is spending into this harmful subsidy bucket, and exactly what they're spending it on, who's the recipient. The transparency is weak. And, that's one of the things that this agreement is trying to address, because in spite of how basic it seems, without the basic information available for all to see, it is very difficult to make judgments about how to improve the process. And while we should all share that objective, oftentimes there are very different objectives that are controlling why data does not become public. In spite of the fact that this is really aimed at a public resource. And so these are sort of some of the mechanics of how things are working in general, as well as in this set of negotiations, but they're an important part of how it all contributes to where we get to in the end. So thanks very much for the question, Ron. Next, please.
Thanks, Michelle. Reyna? So in your opening statement, you mentioned some potential results of this most ambitious reform scenario. Can you say more about that, and also Pew's campaign efforts to raise awareness and support for an agreement?
Yes, thank you, Ron. So yeah, Pew's role, what we do well is we do seek to use science and data to influence public policy and decision making. And so for this negotiating process, we asked ourselves really two questions. What are governments giving in fisheries subsidies, just to have a concept for the number and the dollar amount, but then also what would be the implications of a potential agreement? How helpful could it be? Would it be helpful? And so to answer those two questions, the first one, what are governments giving? We approached Dr. Simaila and his team at the University of British Columbia in Canada, and he and his team, they updated their estimates. They do a fantastic job of going fishing nation by fishing nation and doing a comprehensive study of what they're spending across 13 categories, harmful, beneficial, and ambiguous programs. And so from his team's research, they discovered that for the year 2018, governments are spending $35 billion a year on fisheries subsidies, 22 billion of which are deemed harmful because of their ability to increase effort and to therefore drive overfishing. So to answer the second question, what is the potential for reform and impact, and what could it look like? We approached a research team at the University of California, Santa Barbara, led by Dr. Chris Costello. And their team, they were able to take the subsidies estimates that Dr. Simaila's team came up with, but they also took vessel information from the Global Fishing Watch database. They took fisheries information from the FAO, and they developed a bioeconomic model that can take all of these different data sources, input the WTO proposals on the table, and project what the impact would be on the water. And so from this model, that's where we get the revelation that if WTO members were to completely eliminate all harmful subsidies, and that includes subsidies that go to fuel, subsidies that go to vessel reconstruction and modernization, any subsidy that, again, increases the capacity to fish, if WTO members were to completely eliminate all of those harmful subsidies in just 30 years, by the year 2050, fish biomass could rebound by up to 12.5%. And so that's just because you have removed that excess capacity and that excess pressure, and you've allowed the fish to recover. And so that's what we were able to discover. And if you would like to learn more about those results, please go to subsidyexplorer.org. We dropped the link in the chat, but you can learn not only the first part of the question of what are governments spending, you can go country by country on an interactive map and see exactly what they're spending, category by category. But you could also learn more about that 12.5% and how members can get there. So the international community, to your second part of your question, Ron, has rallied behind these efforts. We're really proud to say that we have 173 now organizations, NGOs from around the world, who have signed on to a policy statement urging WTO members to reach an agreement by the end of this year. So that's 173 organizations who are working, just like many of you all on the phone today, in fishing communities who are aware of how important this agreement is. And so we're in the middle right now of a digital campaign to urge support for an agreement. We're calling it 25 reasons why the WTO should reel in a deal, or why the WTO and why governments should reach this agreement. And it's because we have, we're in the 25-year anniversary of the WTO, but we also have a 25-day negotiating period that we're currently in. And so members are just negotiating nonstop in this period. And we have a digital campaign where we're just urging members to reach this agreement. If you look for the Stop Funding Overfishing hashtag, if you put that in Twitter, you'll see the content. And if you go to stopfundingoverfishing.com, you'll see how you can participate in that. And I can say more about that in my closing remarks. But just to say that the international community has rallied behind this effort. And now it's just up to us to push our governments to make this deal happen. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Reyna. And just to remind everybody here that we will send links, all the links and different papers and everything that we've mentioned here today, we'll send in an email to all participants after the fact. So don't worry about trying to catch everything. And the panelists will also share with us any extra things that they thought that they think are interesting for you. And then actually starting tomorrow, SOA will have up our own page echoing this Stop Funding Overfishing campaign and reposting those 25 reasons. So you can look at our website tomorrow to find that. So we have, we're a little bit behind, but that's fine. I'm going to try to get through as many of these questions as possible, and I'm going to kind of repackage some of them. And this, I'm just going to sort of leave them open for any panelist that jumps in first. So we have a question about how about developing countries like in Africa? Do these harmful subsidies have a greater effect? And I want to combine that question slightly controversially with another question, which says, can you really see China, despite some willingness in theory, end harmful fisheries subsidies when they are increasing substantially their long distance fishing fleet, which actually isn't true anymore since 2015, I believe, or no, 17 rather, and comply with any WTO ruling in that direction should it ultimately materialize?
If I can, I would like to maybe just jump in on the second question on China and their involvement in the negotiations. So I do just want to say, as Pew, we have been monitoring the process, and all members, and not all, but most members have certainly been participating in the process. And so either on their own or negotiating with a block of members. And so just from that alone, that shows us that members are engaged in the process regardless of maybe what their own domestic fishery situation is. And so China, they have put forth a proposal, and the proposal looks at ways to maybe cap their spending. And so to allow a certain amount of subsidy spending, but to cap it at a certain amount. And so that's one approach. There are several different approaches for how to eventually discipline these subsidies. But the point here is that members have been participating, and they have been constructively participating. And with the consolidated text that I mentioned, that does incorporate various elements of the different proposals from the members. And now all members are, as we speak, negotiating on the basis of that one text. And so that does include China, and that does include our big players. And so, they all do have their domestic programs and situations, but all members are still constructively negotiating on this text, and they are looking, as we're continuing to encourage them to look, to be as ambitious as possible. So I just wanted to offer that. I'm not sure if other panelists want to jump in.
I could take off with Africa at the center of my response. So just to give you some data, all right, the top 5 political entities that give the highest subsidies are China, not necessarily in order. China, the EU as a bloc, you have Spain as an individual country, you have Korea, you have Japan. So these are large, rich, developed countries that are giving most of these subsidies. So that's point number one. Number two, if you take the total $35 billion we estimate, 80% of that goes to large industrial fishing scale boats, right? So just see the pictures. Africa is not in the first five. Africa, 80% goes to large industrial. That means 20% is what goes to most African fishing boats. They're small. Now, and this 20% is really important. That means that we have more women fishing as small-scale fishers than large industrial fishers. So that's the third point. We're discriminating against women, again, with tax money, in addition to all the discrimination. And most youths actually operate in the small sector because they're just beginning and developing themselves. So all this actually points to Africa being at a disadvantage, both on the water. You know, we have distant fishing fleets that are being subsidized to go to Africa and fish. China is doing a lot of that with their boats going. So if you take everything, I've given talks to different countries in Africa, Senegal, South Africa, in Ghana, in Kenya, thanks partly to Pew. And when I get there, I tell them, you should be on your rooftops pushing the WTO to take away these subsidies because you are so disadvantaged. For every dollar that an African or a developing country person gets, their fishers in developed world get 7, 1:7. So you are disadvantaged on the water, as I said, but also in the market because they can sell fish cheaply. So if you are an African or a developing tropical country person, you should be at the forefront fighting to take our subsidies because you are so disadvantaged. So that is my take on this, and I stop here.
Yeah, I'd like to jump in a little bit just for a second on the China aspect of the question. I mean, I think we all recognize that China is, you know, at the top of most lists, regardless of what you're talking about, whether it's producing, consuming, fishing, distant water fleet size, subsidy grantor, whatever. China is really, in many ways, the future of fisheries on this planet. And to in any way exclude them from these kinds of discussions hurts everybody. So they really need to be brought into the fold, and whether that's through a combination of cooperation, cajoling, you know, international pressure, research, all the above. But they absolutely need to be at the table. And I'll just say that, for instance, on illegal fishing, the World Wildlife Fund is working with in collaboration with about 10 other local and international NGOs inside China to deal with some of these issues. So there are some hopeful signs of opening and of better understanding, because I think that many of us who have not spent our careers working in China are not necessarily completely conversant and familiar with the mindset, how things work, you know, the needs there that drive many of these policies. And so it's easy to be critical from the outside. But I think that the way to really try to get to yes is to really achieve a much deeper understanding and discussion. And that means building up the relationships, having the personal contacts, building the trust. All of those things take time. And at least in this negotiation and in others I've seen, I hope that we can continue to follow that pathway and bring China in to be a constructive, productive player at the table. Thanks.
Thank you, Michelle, and thank you to everybody for your comments.
And in this, can I chip in, because we're supposed to have some debate here? I really love what you said, Michelle, and I just want to say that African countries, developing countries, small island developing countries, you have more power than you think you have. I think they could actually get China to do certain things just because China feels the affinity. And in fact, these countries boost China, whether it's in the UN or anything. So you can get them to do things without big guns, but just moral high ground, moral standing, ethical pressure, like Michelle said. So please, and young people, oh my gosh, your power is unbelievable. Just use that power. I mean, yeah, so.
Thank you for that additional comment. I wanted to get to, I know we're pressed for time, but I think this question is pretty important given the whole world has been turned upside down by a pandemic. Several people have asked, I think smartly, what role does that have? Someone's mentioned about how the EU has increased their subsidies above the normal ones, just so that those fishermen and seafood companies can survive the pandemic. And I'm sure many countries have done the same. So is this picture more complicated? Does this threaten the reality of this? If we could be really quick with our answers. Andres?
Yeah, thanks, Ron. That's a really excellent question. And it's something that keeps coming up in different talks that I have with people, both in specific countries and sort of, within the WTO discussions. And I think the answer is actually a positive one, right? So the pandemic has totally upended everything, right? But in the context of this agreement, right, it actually adds a lot of arguments for changing the way that we're giving subsidies, right? So to give you an example, harmful subsidies means bigger boat, more fuel, whatever, right? And so right now, if the problem is you don't have a market for your fish, well, a bigger boat's not going to help you, right? Cheaper gas isn't going to help you because nobody's buying the fish. That's, the amount of fish isn't the problem here. And so I think a lot of countries are really quickly realizing that and actually changing their stuff on the fly. That's not always a good thing, because poorly designed policy is poorly designed policy, whether or not the objective of it might be good or not. But for example, you're seeing a lot of sort of direct supports coming in, for example, right? So you'll give money like cash or whatever to people instead of paying for a boat or instead of paying for gas. And that's already moving in the right direction in terms of more direct support for communities. Obviously, what we really need that people aren't doing yet is a long-term plan, right? And I think the pandemic is we're still in that stage where everyone's sort of scrambling a little bit to know what's going to happen with the economy, with health, obviously, in the short term. And so in the long term, we need a lot better planning. But again, in terms of the agreement, it just goes to show that, fuel subsidies, bigger boats or whatever aren't the problem here. And I think people are really cognizant of that because of the pandemic. And so I think it is nudging us in the right direction, right? And so I think, when people ask me like, oh, but how are we going to support people during the pandemic? People are quickly realizing that those harmful subsidies are not the right way to support. So it opens up that avenue for listening and all the stuff that we've talked about, right? Thinking about different ways to do it.
Thanks, Andres. I'm not gonna, unless anybody really is itching to speak, I just want to, okay, Dr. Simaila, go ahead.
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I've just put out a link to an article I wrote exactly about this for the World Economic Forum. It's an op-ed, and you will see how we can use our tax resources to help people and nature in situations like this. That's it. Thank you, Ron, for allowing me. Yeah.
I don't see that link. Did you put it in the chat?
It's now there,
Okay,
typically I didn't put enter, Yeah, it's there now, yeah.
Okay, we have like a lot of questions. So what I'll do at this point is, since we are at time and I want to be respectful of everybody's time, I'll ask everybody to do their 1-minute closing remark that we've discussed. And then if the panelists want to stay for a few extra minutes along with our guests to answer a few extra questions, that'd be amazing. But those who have to leave can leave as soon as we're done. Please hang on for just 5 more minutes. And then I want to just throw a curveball here. In your final words, what can young ocean leaders do to support this cause of stop funding overfishing? I also just wanted to frame out, and I was really struck by you all reminding us that this has taken 20 years. Most of my life, we've been negotiating this. So can you maybe give just a piece of advice? How do young people keep the faith? These negotiations, ocean conservation, it's slow, it's hard, it takes a long time. how do we keep the faith? And with that, I ask you all to do your closing remarks, and I give it back to Dr. Simaila.
Yeah, so there's no time, so I'm really going on. We've talked about a lot of things. I want each of you to think of three people that you know, three people in your country or in your networks who can help us move forward, and write a nice short letter to them to push country representative negotiating now to really do something to protect our ocean by taking away harmful subsidies. Who are the three people in the whole world that can do this? Think and then get them going. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And next over to Andres.
Thanks, Rod. So keeping the faith, oof, especially in these times, right? 2020 is maybe not the right year to ask that question, but we are moving forward, right? And I think if all of the recent stuff shows us anything, is that, you know, there are huge challenges, and, you know, we can't pretend that everyone is in the same boat yet in terms of moving towards ocean conservation and environmental justice. But at the end of the day, there is more of us, you know, and so I think that is something to keep in mind. And there are people pushing for this, and the grass is really slow, but eventually you go outside of one day and it's like, oh, look, everything's green, right? So that's what we're hoping for. And in terms of the subsidies, talk to people. I saw a bunch of questions in there about kind of specific stuff about like Ecuador. I think there was some, and in Africa, China's come up. You know, few people know these local things better than you do and then your friends do. And so the thing now is to make sure that your voice and those people's voices are heard by these people. I mean, if you look through Twitter, Instagram, not so much Instagram, but more Twitter, which is where a lot of institutions have their accounts, often the only voices you hear are like the industry lobby groups, maybe some of the NGOs, that sort of thing. And you don't hear these people because often they're not on those platforms. Right? And so you as young people, if you can bring those voices in, that's how we're going to change this narrative. And that's how we're going to convince people making the policy and the politicians that there are a lot of people, again, there's more of us that are interested in this sort of change.
Thanks. Can I just jump in here? I think I'm going to go next. So I'd say on the one hand, stay optimistic, but channel your impatience. Channel that and channel it into something that makes noise. This is a niche area. If you talk to almost anybody you know about this, they kind of look at you like, what? Isn't this all taken care of already? No, it isn't. So I'd say instead of 3, go for a much higher number. Could it be even 100? Could you get out on all your channels? Could you do it? Yes, you can. Think positively and have each of the people that you go to, ask them to do something. Send a tweet, send a message, send an email. If they don't do that, send a old-fashioned handwritten piece of paper to the decision makers. Ask them to do the right thing. For all of our sakes, ask them. Thank you.
Thanks, Michelle. And I'll just jump in here too with the closing words. So how to keep the faith. First, I just want to reiterate that we have made progress. We do have that one text that the members are negotiating off the basis of, consolidated text with all, various elements of different proposals there. So that is progress, and they just have to keep on working on that basis of that text until December. And so let's just encourage them. We have our campaign. Please get involved in the 25-day campaign. Go to stopfundingoverfishing.com and send some tweets, make some Facebook posts. I also do have a list of social media handles for trade ministers and fisheries ministers in your countries. So if you could even tweet your trade and fisheries officials, that would be great. And I can send you that information. My email is rgilbert@pewtrust.org, and I can share that with you. But yes, just please make your voice heard. Get on social media and get involved in this campaign.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your closing words. I will give it to Brandon to close the webinar and then take it back to ask some more questions if everyone's able to stay on. Just again, a reminder, we will send you a very detailed email with all of the ways summarized, how to get involved, all of the links to Stop Funding Overfishing, the Subsidy Explorer, etc. So don't try to memorize everybody's email right now. We will send you all an email. You've registered for the webinar. And that will give you the tools to share this and amplify this in your own channels. So with that, Brandon, could you close this out?
Thank you, Ron, and thank you everyone for joining, for your energy and your attention. I personally right now feel both indignant but informed and ready to tell not just 3 people, but anyone that will listen to me on this topic, because like several of our attendees who are commenting, I feel very strongly that this needs to be addressed in a big way. And I'm really happy that the panelists that we've had on are really heavyweights in that fight. So just to quickly divert into upcoming SOA events that I believe would be very much privy or pertinent to this audience. November 19th, we have our upcoming SOA Connects Latin America edition. You won't want to miss this. There'll be a lot of talks actually specifically about this topic. Our hub in Ecuador is actually leading a campaign against Chinese fleets who are encroaching on the Galapagos Islands and fishing their exclusive economic zone. So this will be part of this conversation in a different tone. This will be the first time we've ever actually held a summit entirely in Spanish. So please do come if you would like. And the event will also highlight the importance of ancestral wisdom and the role younger generations have in preserving these indigenous communities and their stewardship practices. Well, also the day after, November 20th, and I'll be dropping in a link very shortly to all of these events for you to register, we'll have a European Union community call. So please come to that. We'll actually have the former Director General of the World Trade Organization on that call. That is Pascal Lamy. I know many of you know who he is, and he is going to be sharing his insights on this topic and many others. And you'll also learn how to get involved with Mission Starfish 2030, a really powerful initiative. And lastly, we'll be hosting an event on December 3rd called Defend the Deep. And this will really be a way for you to understand another critical issue that is timely and urgent, which is deep sea mining. So the event will highlight different voices throughout the world and the efforts of our young leaders and global youth everywhere that are mobilizing to defend the deep and really preserve our underwater ecosystems. So thank you all for coming, and thank you for our panelists if you're able to stay on and answer more questions. If not, we'll make sure to get these answered in some way, shape, or form. And thank you all again. Ron?
Yeah, so yeah, a round of applause for everybody. I know 2 of our panelists do have to jump, maybe others, but I will just start throwing the questions and just leave if you've got to. Michelle asked, sorry, you asked me something here. You can only, yeah, if you could share any links with us via email, that would be great. So we'll share that during in the follow-up email.
Great,
So
thanks so much, everybody. Thank you.
One question that's interesting, maybe Dr. Simaila has some context here, is aquaculture a sustainable way forward to continue to provide seafood to a growing population? I suppose this question within the context of taking that money out of fisheries and putting it somewhere else, perhaps?
Yeah, so I'll quickly chip in and then I'll have to run. But yeah, aquaculture can be part of the solution, and it's already in many instances. But as everything, it has to be done carefully. And because there are different types of aquaculture. We have aquaculture that needs fish and fish meal and fish oil to keep it going. If we feed that, if we grow them like salmon and tunas, we're going to affect, and we're already affecting the natural system because we take it. So we need to do it carefully. In fact, I have a paper which is now under review, and the title is Aquaculture Over Optimism. I feel there's too much optimism about what aquaculture can do for us. We have to temper that, think through, and let it work for us sustainably. Otherwise, we're gonna mess it up again, as we are good at doing. All right.
Told me about that paper 3 years ago, so I've been looking for it ever since.
It's under review now. It's under review now. So
okay.
Hopefully you'll soon get it. It's a tough paper for the community to take, the agriculture community, right? So we are fighting them. Yeah, the reviewers are, you know how it is, but it will come out somewhere. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Simaila. It's really been a privilege to have you
And
with
thanks
us.
to the young people. Please keep the fight on. The future is in your hands and our hands. So take care. All the best.
Andres, do you have a chance for one last question, which I'm also quite curious about?
Yeah, they can say one for it.
You know, we might approve this great new WTO agreement ending or, you know, limiting harmful subsidies. I think a lot of people are probably wondering, how do we ensure that countries are adhering to that? And is there, I mean, I know some of the background of the WTO and how that works.
Yeah.
For our audience, how does WTO enforce things? What's the enforcement mechanism there? And will this work, basically?
Yeah, for sure. That's actually an excellent question. It's something I get asked all the time. And I think essentially, this is part of the reason why it's been so difficult to get an agreement. And that's because the WTO, as opposed to pretty much any other agreement that you can think of, Paris, whatever, is actually legally binding, right? So this is a legally binding body. And so what that means is once you enter an agreement in there, if you're part of the WTO, you have to abide by whatever that agreement says. And so what does have to abide mean? Essentially, let's say they agreed to stop harmful subsidies, right? And the agreement signed and ratified by December, hopefully. As of then, or whatever burn-in period they decide to put in the agreement, if you put in a harmful subsidy for a fishery, okay, any other country can actually, sue is not the right word, but they can basically sue you at the WTO and say, hey, listen, this country is breaking the rules and they're harming trade, right? So they're artificially lowering the cost of their fisheries, which then makes them be able to be more competitive in the market than they would otherwise be. And that harms my fishing industry, right? So at that point, the WTO can say they'll do a review and there'll be evidence presented. And, you know, it can go all the way to up to a panel of judges during their appeals process. And so long story short, if those judges find that you indeed are breaking this agreement, you can actually have very real trade sanctions, right? So you may not be able to actually trade with other WTO countries until you rectify that situation. And so again, this is the reason why this is such a huge deal for countries, right? So, and also it's a huge deal for us, right? Because as opposed to other agreements, if this passes, if this goes through, this is a very, very, very real and tangible win for ocean conservation. And, you know, in my view, for better supporting people that really need this type of support.
Excellent. Thank you so much for adding that context. I think that we've sort of addressed most of these questions. I guess maybe you could talk as a concluding remark. There's been a lot of questions related to small scale fishers in Africa, whether there's size of subsidy matters. So are they more good for small scale fisheries, more bad for small scale fisheries, et cetera? How do we tip the balance and make sure, we're supporting small scale fishers in the context of this discussion?
Yeah, so I think again, the first part of this is to prohibit those harmful subsidies. You know, Rashid mentioned, so to give you a sense of scale, right? So artisanal fishers and fisheries support over 90% of all the employment related to oceans, right? It's by far the biggest ocean employer, right? So this is over 300 million people all over the world. And yet they're only getting about 15% of the total subsidies, right? And so that obviously speaks to a huge disparity. But when you hear people talk about subsidies, you know, at the political level, it's always we're supporting our local communities, right? But the fact is they're not supporting their local communities, right? And so the reason those harmful subsidies are given out that way, again, often is because of power dynamics, right? So these are subsidies that are really easy to give without a lot of oversight, which at the same time makes it really easy for people with political power to capture them, right? And so by stopping that and saying, okay, we are holding you to your word that you're supporting local fishing communities, we can't do it in these ways that don't actually support them. So now how do we actually do it? You know, how do we, and I think I wrote a paper with some other, with a bunch of really, really great people. This is pre-pandemic, like March or something. It was like early pandemic. And this is called changing the narrative. You know, and so the whole part of this was, listen, we need to change this narrative because the fact that it's being framed as we're going to stop subsidizing or we're going to stop helping fishing communities, that is a framing that's given by political lobbyists, right? And so this is not what this agreement is trying to do. We're not trying to stop supporting fishing communities. We're trying to help fishing communities by prohibiting subsidies that we know are harmful, right? And so I think that's really the key here. So whenever you hear about this stuff, remember this agreement is not about stopping subsidies or stopping support. It's about ending harmful subsidies, right? And there's a reason why we call them harmful.
Thank you so much, Andres, for those final comments and clarifications. I think they were really, really important. And I hope that everyone will take a look at the recording who had left already. But yeah, with that, I think we'll bring things to a close. Thank you, everyone who hung on an extra 17 minutes. You guys are really committed, and we appreciate you all. So with that, have a lovely night, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Muchas gracias.
Thank you. And thank you, Andres, for staying on. We appreciate you.